The self you are when alone is the self you truly are. Everything else is performance. We perform constantly, every conversation, every pause before speaking. We adjust our posture when someone enters the room. We modulate our voice depending on who is listening. But what happens when the audience leaves, when the door closes and you are left with only yourself? Who are you then? Most of us do not know the answer. We have been performing so long, we have forgotten there is a difference between the actor and the role. We have confused the mask with the face beneath it. And in those rare moments when we are truly alone, we sometimes catch a glimpse of something we did not recognize, a stranger wearing our skin. The question is not just philosophical, it is existential. It is about the terrifying possibility that maybe there is no core self at all, that we are nothing but a series of performances, each one tailored to its audience. And when the audience disappears, so do we. Jean-Paul Sartre had a concept he called the look. It is the experience of being seen. The moment we feel ourselves being watched, something fundamental changes. We become objects in the gaze of another. We freeze. We perform. You're alone in your apartment, completely relaxed, moving in ways that are utterly unself-conscious. Then you notice someone watching through the window. What happens? Instant transformation. Your body tenses, your movements become deliberate. You become aware of yourself as an object being perceived. Sartre called this being for others as opposed to being for itself. When you are alone, you exist in pure subjectivity. But the moment another consciousness enters, you split. Part of you remains subjective, another part becomes objective. You see yourself as the other sees you. Here's the disturbing part. Sartre argued we can never escape this. Even when physically alone, we carry the internalized gaze of others with us. We have absorbed society's judgment. We perform even when no one is watching because we have internalized the audience. The question then becomes whether there is any way back, whether we can strip away the layers of social conditioning and find something authentic underneath, or whether authenticity itself is a myth, a comforting story we tell ourselves to avoid the more unsettling truth that we are performances all the way down. The ancient Greeks had a word for private life, idios. It's where we get idiot from. In ancient Athens, living a purely private life was considered a form of stupidity, a failure to be fully human. Because for the Greeks, humans were fundamentally social animals. We become who we are through interaction with others. But there was a tension. They also valued self-knowledge, introspection, the examined life. Socrates said, "Know thyself," which implies a turning inward, a private investigation of one's own soul. So which is it? Are we most ourselves in public or in private? In performance or in solitude? Marcus Aurelius wrote in private journals, journals never meant to be published, journals that represent him as alone as a person can be in writing. He kept returning to this question of who he was beneath the imperial purple. Strip away the title, the power, the expectations, what remains? Every morning he would remind himself that he was just a man, that his soul was the same as any other soul, that death would come for him as it came for everyone. This was not false humility, it was an attempt to separate his essential self from his social role, to find the human underneath the emperor. But Marcus Aurelius never stopped being emperor. Even in his private moments, even in his journals, he was still performing the role, still trying to be a good Stoic, still measuring himself against an ideal. The private self and the public self bled into each other. Maybe that is the point. Maybe the question itself is wrong. Maybe there is no pure, authentic self that exists independently of our social rules. Maybe identity is more like a river than a rock, constantly flowing, constantly changing, never quite the same from moment to moment. Blaise Pascal noticed something odd about human behavior. We cannot sit still. We cannot be alone with ourselves. We fill every moment with distraction, with activity, with noise. And Pascal asked why? Why are we so afraid of silence? His answer was devastating. We are afraid of what we will find there. In the silence, in the solitude, we are forced to confront the reality of our condition, our mortality, our insignificance, the emptiness at the core of our existence. So we run. We distract ourselves. We fill our lives with anything to avoid being alone with ourselves. Pascal wrote that all of humanity's problems stem from our inability to sit quietly in a room alone. Think about how uncomfortable most people are with genuine solitude. Not just physical aloneness, the absence of any distraction. No phone, no book, no music, just sitting, just being. Most of us cannot do it. Within minutes, we are reaching for something, anything to fill the void. We're checking our phones, making lists, planning our next activity, doing everything we can to avoid simply being present with ourselves. This avoidance is telling us something, that when we are alone, when we strip away all the distractions, we encounter a kind of nothingness. Not that we don't exist, but that our existence feels groundless, arbitrary, meaningless. This is what existentialists call the void, the vertiginous feeling of radical freedom, of being utterly responsible for creating your own meaning in a universe that provides none. It's terrifying. So we fill it. We construct elaborate scaffolding of social roles, projects, beliefs, relationships, anything to give us the illusion of solidity. But the void is always there, waiting. And in moments of true solitude, when all the scaffolding falls away, we feel it. We feel the groundlessness of our existence. That's who we are when no one is watching. Not a solid, coherent self, a question mark, a space of possibility we are constantly trying to fill. There was a psychological experiment, the White Room study. Researchers put subjects alone in a room with nothing to do. No phone, no book, nothing. Just a chair and their thoughts. They could leave whenever they wanted, but they were asked to stay for 15 minutes. In one version, the only object in the room besides the chair was a button that delivered a mild electric shock when pressed. 67% of men and 25% of women chose to shock themselves rather than sit alone with their thoughts. They preferred physical discomfort to simply being alone with themselves. One participant shocked himself 190 times in 15 minutes. People would rather experience physical discomfort than simply be alone with themselves. This tells us something profound. We are allergic to ourselves. Or more precisely, we are allergic to the version of ourselves that exists without external stimulation, without performance, without distraction. Why? What is it about solitude that we find so unbearable? Part of it is boredom. Our brains are wired to seek novelty. But boredom alone does not explain the intensity of the discomfort. There is something deeper. What people experience in that white room is a confrontation with the constructed nature of their identity. When we are engaged with the world, our sense of self feels solid, coherent, real. We know who we are because we are doing things, playing our roles. But remove all of that. Suddenly, the self starts to feel less solid, less real. We become aware of the arbitrary nature of our thoughts, the randomness of our mental associations, the fact that beneath the surface narrative of "I'm a person with a coherent identity," there is just a stream of disconnected sensations, memories, impulses. This is what Buddhists have been saying for thousands of years, that the self is an illusion, a construct, a story we tell ourselves to create the appearance of continuity and coherence. And in deep meditation, when you strip away distractions and simply observe the mind, you can see this directly. You can watch the self dissolve. But most of us are not ready for that. Most of us need the illusion of a solid self to function. So when we are placed in a situation that threatens to reveal the constructed nature of our identity, we panic. We reach for anything, even physical pain, to reassert the sense that we are real, that we exist. The person who shocked himself 190 times was not just bored, he was fighting for his psychological life. Desperately trying to feel real in a situation that was revealing his unreality. Carl Jung called this the persona, the face we present to the world, the role we play in social situations. Jung was clear that the persona is not the same as the true self. It is a compromise between who we really are and what society expects of us. It is necessary for functioning in the world, but it is also dangerous because we can start to believe that the mask is the face. Jung wrote about patients who had become so identified with their personas that they had lost touch with everything else. the successful businessman who could not stop performing success even at home, the devoted mother who could not remember who she was before children, the intellectual who could not turn off the need to appear smart. These people had forgotten they were wearing masks. They had confused the performance with the performer, and when the mask inevitably failed them, they experienced psychological collapse because they had built their entire identity on something external, something performative, and now it was gone. But Jung also argued that we can never fully remove the persona. It is not like we can strip away all social conditioning and find some pure, authentic self underneath. We are social creatures. We need roles. The persona serves a function. The goal is not to eliminate the persona, but to maintain awareness of the distinction, to know that you are playing a role while you are playing it, to be able to step back and recognize which mask you are wearing, and crucially to have access to something deeper than any of these masks. But what is that something deeper? Jung called it the self with a capital S, the totality of the psyche, the integrated whole that includes all our masks but is not reducible to any of them. And we encounter this self most directly in solitude, in dreams, in moments of deep introspection. But here's where it gets strange. Even in solitude, even when we think we are finally alone with our true self, we are still performing. We are still watching ourselves, judging ourselves, narrating our experience. There is still an internal audience, an internalized observer that will not shut up. So who is watching when no one else is? Who is that internal observer? Is it another mask, another layer of performance? Or is it something more fundamental, the irreducible core of consciousness itself? These are questions that have haunted philosophers for centuries. We still do not have clear answers, but the fact that we can ask them tells us something important. We are beings for whom being is an issue. We cannot help but be aware of ourselves, cannot help but perform for ourselves even when no one else is. Maybe that is the deepest answer. Who are you when no one is watching? You are the one who is watching. Thomas Merton entered a Trappist monastery in the 1940s, one of the strictest orders in Christianity. The monks took vows of silence. They spoke only when necessary. They spent most of their time in solitary prayer and contemplation. Merton thought he was escaping the world, escaping the noise and performance of social life to find his true self in solitude. And for years he wrote about the peace he found, the clarity that came from stripping away distractions. But then something strange happened. He began to notice that even in the silence, he was still performing. He was performing for God, for his fellow monks, for his abbot, and most insidiously for himself. He was crafting a narrative of himself as a monk, as a spiritual person, as someone who had transcended worldly concerns. This narrative was just as constructed as any role he had played in the secular world, maybe more so, because now it had the veneer of spirituality, of authenticity. He was wearing a holy mask, but it was still a mask. Merton wrote about this crisis in his journals. He realized that solitude alone was not enough. You could be physically alone and still be performing, still be watching yourself, still be constructing an identity. True solitude was not about physical isolation, but about psychological nakedness, a willingness to let go of all narratives, all performances, all attempts to know yourself in a fixed way. This led him to a conclusion. He wrote that it is in deep solitude that he found the gentleness with which he could truly love others. The more solitary he became, the more affection he had for them, pure affection, filled with reverence for the solitude of others. What Merton discovered was that the deepest solitude does not separate us from others. It connects us more authentically, because it strips away the performances that usually mediate our relationships. When you stop performing for yourself, you also stop demanding that others perform for you. You can finally see them as they are, not as the roles they play. But getting to that point required what Merton called the death of the false self, letting go of every identity he had constructed, every narrative he had told himself about who he was. And this was not a one-time event. It was a continuous process, a constant dying and rebirth. Here is what is unsettling. If the false self has to die for the true self to emerge, what guarantee do we have that there is anything underneath? What if we strip away all the masks and find nothing but emptiness? What if the false self is the only self there is? Merton would say that the emptiness is the point, that the true self is not a thing, not a fixed identity, but a kind of openness, a spaciousness, a capacity to be present without grasping for definition. But that is a hard teaching. It is not comforting. It does not give us the solid ground we are looking for. And most of us are not willing to go that far. We need our narratives, our identities, our sense of who we are, even if they are constructions, even if they are performances. They are necessary constructions, necessary performances. Without them, we would dissolve. Or would we? That is the question Merton left us with, and it can only be answered through direct experience, through the willingness to sit in that white room and see what remains when everything else falls away. Now, shame is the emotion that most clearly reveals the gap between our public and private selves. Shame is what we feel when the mask slips, when others see something we wanted to hide, when the performance fails. Emmanuel Levinas wrote about the structure of shame. He noted that shame always involves a doubling of consciousness. When you feel ashamed, you see yourself from the outside, through the eyes of the other. You experience yourself as an object of judgment. But here's what is interesting. You can feel ashamed even when no one else is present. You can do something in private, something no one will ever know about, and still feel deeply ashamed. This suggests that we have internalized the gaze of others so thoroughly that we have carried it with us always. We have become our own judges, our own audiences. Freud called this the superego, the internalized parent or authority figure that watches and evaluates everything we do. But it is not just parents we have internalized. It's a whole society, a whole culture, a complex web of expectations and norms and values that we have absorbed and now use to police ourselves. So when you are alone, when no one is watching, you are still being watched by yourself, by the internalized other. And this internal watcher can be even more harsh than any external observer, because you cannot escape it. You can close the door on other people, but you cannot close the door on yourself. This creates a strange situation. The version of you that exists when no one is watching might actually be more self-conscious, more performative, more judgmental than the version that exists in public. Because in public, you can at least get feedback, can adjust your performance. In private, you are left with only your imagination of how others would judge you. And that imagination is often worse than reality. There is a particular form of shame, existential shame. This is not shame about something you have done. It is shame about what you are, about your very existence, the feeling that you are fundamentally flawed, unworthy, wrong. Where does this come from? It comes from the gap between the ideal self you think you should be and the actual self you experience yourself as being. It comes from the constant awareness that you are performing, that you are not authentic, that beneath all your masks there might be nothing of value. This is the dark side of self-awareness. The more conscious you become of the constructed nature of your identity, the more you realize you are always performing, the more you feel like a fraud. And this fraudulence breeds a deep, pervasive shame that colors everything you do, even in solitude. There's a myth worth revisiting: Narcissus. Most people know the story. Narcissus sees his reflection in water, falls in love with it, wastes away staring at his own image. It's usually read as a cautionary tale about vanity, but there's another way to read it. Narcissus does not recognize that the image is himself. He thinks it is someone else, another beautiful being that he desires. He is in love with his own reflection because he does not know it is a reflection. He mistakes the image for reality. This is closer to the truth of our situation. When we are alone, when we examine ourselves, we are always looking at a reflection, an image, a representation. We can never see ourselves directly. We can never escape the mediation of consciousness, the fact that awareness itself creates distance. The Buddhist teacher Ajahn Chah used to ask his students a question: who is the one who knows? When you are aware of your thoughts, your feelings, your perceptions, who is the one doing the knowing? If you try to turn attention back on itself to observe the observer, you just create another layer of observation. It's like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. It cannot be done. This is what Vedantic philosophers call the witness consciousness. There is a part of awareness that is always prior to whatever you are aware of. It's the ground of experience. but it can never itself become an object of experience. It is you, but it is not you. It is the space in which all your performances occur, but it is not itself a performance. Some spiritual traditions say this witness consciousness is the true self, the unchanging awareness that persists through all changes. Others say it is not a self at all, that calling it a self is just another conceptual mistake. But either way, there is something here worth attending to. When you are alone, when you strip away the performances and the personas, what remains? There is still awareness, there is still consciousness, there is still the fact of experiencing, even if what you are experiencing is emptiness or uncertainty or the absence of a fixed identity. Maybe that is the answer. Who are you when no one is watching? You are the watching itself. You are the awareness that is always already there, prior to all constructions and performances. You are not a what or a who, but a happening, a process, an opening. This is not satisfying. We want something more concrete, more definite. We want to point to something and say, this is me, this is my true self. But maybe the dissatisfaction itself is instructive. Maybe it is telling us we are asking the wrong kind of question. There's a concept in psychology called theory of mind, the ability to attribute mental states to others, to recognize that other people have beliefs and desires and experiences different from your own. Children develop this around age 4 or 5. Before that, they are essentially solipsistic. But even as adults, we still struggle to really believe in the subjective experience of others. We know intellectually that everyone around us has an inner life as complex as our own, but we do not feel it. We cannot access it directly. Thomas Nagel wrote an essay called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" His point was that even if we knew everything objectively about bat neurology and behavior, we still wouldn't know what it is like to be a bat, to have the subjective experience of being a bat. There is an irreducible firstness to experience that cannot be captured from the outside. The same is true of other humans. I can never know what it is like to be you, to have your experiences, to see the world from your perspective. You are forever alien to me, and I am forever alien to you. But here's the twist. I am also alien to myself. I cannot step outside my own subjectivity to observe it. I cannot know what it is like to be me from the outside. I only ever have the inside view, and the inside view is constantly shifting, constantly changing, constantly disappearing even as it appears. This means the self is fundamentally unknowable, not because it is hidden or mysterious, but because there is no stable, fixed thing there to know. You cannot pin down consciousness any more than you can pin down a river. You can observe it, describe it, analyze it, but the moment you think you have grasped it, it is already changed. So when you are alone, when you think you are finally encountering your true self without the distortion of social performance, what you are actually encountering is this fundamental unknowability. You are encountering the fact that you are a process, not a thing, a becoming, not a being. And this might be the most authentic thing about you, not some fixed essence, not some core identity, but this very flux, this very changeability. You are most yourself when you stop trying to be anyone at all. But can you live like that? Can you function in the world without a stable sense of identity? Can you maintain relationships, hold down a job, pursue goals, love people, if you don't have a solid answer to the question, who am I? Some spiritual traditions say yes. They say the dissolution of the ego is liberation, that it frees you to respond more authentically to each moment without the burden of maintaining a consistent self-image. But Western psychology tends to be more skeptical. It sees the development of coherent identity as essential to mental health. It sees the dissolution of identity as pathology, as dissociation, as failure of integration. Who is right? Maybe both. Maybe some level of stable identity is necessary for functioning, that too much rigidity becomes a prison. Maybe the goal is something like fluid stability, a sense of self that is coherent enough to navigate life, but flexible enough to adapt and change. Alexandra David Neal traveled to Tibet in the early 20th century. She spent 14 years studying with Buddhist teachers, living in caves, practicing meditation in extreme isolation. She was trying to discover who she was beneath all the layers of social conditioning. One of the practices she learned was called chode, a Tibetan Buddhist meditation that involves visualizing your own death, your body being cut up and fed to demons. The point is to confront and dissolve attachment to the body, to the self, to life itself. It is deliberately terrifying. David Neal described practicing this alone in a cave, in the middle of the night, in complete darkness. She said the fear was overwhelming, primal, absolute, but she forced herself to stay with it, to not run, to not distract herself. And after hours, something shifted. The fear dissolved, and with it, something else dissolved too. Her sense of being a separate self, a distinct entity. She described a feeling of vast spaciousness, of being continuous with everything around her, of not knowing where she ended and the world began. This lasted for several hours. Then gradually her ordinary sense of self returned. But it was different now, lighter, less solid. She said she no longer fully believed in herself as a fixed entity. She could see through the construction, even as she continued to live within it. What David Neal discovered is what mystics from various traditions have been saying for millennia, that the self is not what we think it is, that beneath the surface identity there is something else, something that is both nothing and everything, both empty and full. But here is the question. Is this experience revealing truth about the self, or is it just another kind of experience, another state of consciousness, no more real or true than any other? Is the mystical experience of selflessness more authentic than the ordinary experience of being a person with a name and a history? The mystic would say yes. They would say the ordinary sense of self is an illusion, and that in the mystical experience you are seeing through the illusion. But the skeptic would say that is just another story, another interpretation, that there's no way to verify whether the mystical experience is revealing truth or just producing a different kind of subjective state. I do not know who is right. Maybe it does not matter. Maybe the question is not whether the mystical experience is objectively true, but whether it is useful, whether it helps you live better, more fully, more compassionately. What I do know is this: whether or not there is a fixed, essential self underneath all our performances, the question itself is valuable. The inquiry itself is valuable. The willingness to sit with uncertainty, to examine your own experience, to notice when you are performing and when you are not. That willingness changes something fundamental about how you live. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine you could press a button and instantly become perfectly authentic. All your performances would drop away. All your social masks would dissolve. You would be completely, totally yourself in every situation, with no filtering, no adjustment, no consideration of how others might perceive you. Would you press it? Most people would say no, because we intuitively understand that some level of performance is necessary, that complete authenticity would make us insufferable. It would destroy relationships, end careers, alienate everyone around us. If you said exactly what you thought in every moment, if you expressed every fleeting emotion without censorship, if you never adjusted your behavior based on context, you would be someone no one wanted to be around. So authenticity in the pure, radical sense is not actually desirable. What we really want is something more nuanced. We want to be authentic enough to feel genuine, to feel like we are not betraying ourselves, but not so authentic that we are destructive. We want what Harry Frankfurt called sincerity rather than authenticity. Sincerity means being true to what you genuinely care about, what really matters to you, even if that means performing different roles in different contexts. It means maintaining integrity, a coherent set of values and commitments, even while adapting to circumstances. The sincere person can be a different employee and friend and parent, not because they're fake, but because they are responding appropriately to different relationships and contexts. The key is that there is a through line, a consistency of character, even though the external manifestation changes. This is closer to what most of us are actually looking for. We are not looking for some pure, unchanging essence that we express identically in all situations. We are looking for a sense of coherence, of not feeling split, of living in alignment with our values. But here's the problem. How do we know what our values really are? How do we distinguish between the values we genuinely hold and the values we have absorbed from society? How do we know when we are being sincere and when we are just performing sincerity? This is where it gets recursive, where the questions start to eat themselves. Because the moment you try to examine your own motivations, your own values, your own authenticity, you create distance. You split into observer and observed. And which one is the real you? The one doing the examining or the one being examined? Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe the question itself is the trap. Who are you when no one is watching? Maybe the answer is that you are the question itself, the uncertainty, the not knowing, the space between what you think you are and what you might be. And maybe learning to live in that space without grasping for solid answers, without demanding certainty, without needing to know exactly who you are at all times. Maybe that is what it means to be human. Not a fixed self, not a performance, but the ongoing process of becoming. The constant negotiation between solitude and society, between authenticity and adaptation, between who you think you are and who you actually are in any given moment. The self you are when alone is not a discovery, it is a creation, and it is never finished.